Hey, what's up, YouTube? I was on a ride the other day with a buddy of mine, and we got to discussing what the different dual sports are that are out on the market. And it dawned on me that we use the term dual sport, enduro, street and trail, and to some degree adventure bike. And depending on who you're talking to, those are like interchangeable. I've kind of arrived at the point where there are a lot of bikes that all of us agree is a dual sport, and we all use that term when describing different things. But I think that the definition, depending on who you're talking to, is very different. And today I basically wanted to answer the question, what is a dual sport motorcycle? So, I mean, right off the bat, a lot of people are going to say, well, a dual sport motorcycle is a motorcycle or, basically a dirt bike with a plate. And while I agree that, you could say that, no different than you could say that various adventure bikes fall into the range of dual sport, various dual sports fall into the range of adventure bikes, and everybody gets to define what they want, a motorcycle to be. But I really want to like put a fine point and draw a circle around a very specific segment of motorcycles because I actually think that dual sports in general is a really wide range of motorcycles, even if I put a really finite definition on that. So when I'm talking about some of these bikes, I mean, we're talking about like the KLR 650, the CRF 300L, the KTM 500 EXE. And so when we're talking about these bikes, we're talking about stuff that is about one step away from being a race bike all the way to something that many people would classify as an adventure bike every bit as much as they might call it a dual sport or even more of an adventure bike than that. Which makes me ask the question, is a Tenere 700 a dual sport? Is the TW200 a dual sport? Like I can even go to Yamaha's website and Yamaha claims that the TW200 is a dual sport, but would I classify it as a dual sport? So let's talk about this for a second. Personally, if I'm going to define something as a dual sport, I'm going to draw the first line at single cylinder. I hope that in the future we can look at bikes that we would consider step away from a race bike that are twin cylinders like the Tenere 700. Potentially something on par with like the KTM 390 Adventure or something like that. I know the 390 is a single cylinder, but I'm saying like if we got into some of those small bore twins, we took a CB 500X engine and stuffed it into a CRF 250L frame or something like that and got to a reasonable weight, I would like to entertain that. But as of today, I still feel like with the materials and prices and engineering and all that stuff that people are willing to invest in, I still feel like the Tenere 700 is meant to spend the majority of its time on the pavement versus the dirt, whereas a dual sport in itself is designed to do both equally well. Obviously, there are preference in each of them, but at its core, when you look at the center of the market of dual sports, that bike is meant to do either or 50-50. So the second defining principle to me would be 21-inch wheel. That in particular affects the TW200. I understand that Yamaha puts that plate on it, but I feel like a dual sport came out of the need, especially here on the East Coast, to take a dirt bike, use it for a short stretch on the pavement to go in between trails. So people started putting plates on their dirt bikes. Emissions and noise and all the other things that happen here with private property and whatnot on the East Coast meant that we had to spend more time on the pavement. And I don't know the history all that well, but I'm pretty confident that the manufacturers realized that the consumers wanted a bike that already had a plate with it, so they started offering that straight from the factory, which would be the third point after 21-inch wheel. Having a dirt bike, potentially a race bike with a plate, so it had a 21-inch front wheel, but also came stock with DOT equipment being today the emissions stuff, but more importantly, mirrors, headlight, indicators, and that type of thing. Now, this enters an interesting question. I said I would exclude the TW200, and I say that because it doesn't have a 21-inch front wheel, and I actually think that the TW's original intent was it's like a farm bike. It's the kind of bike that instead of an ATV that you would take hunting, it's capable of getting in and out of places very easily with very little effort. I mean, if you got to tow a carcass out of the woods or whatever it would be, it would do that. But it doesn't fall into this only because I exclude it from 21-inch wheel. But if I play that same rule, then I ask, does the Royal Enfield Himalayan also fall into the range of being a dual sport? When I look at the KLR 650, the KTM 350 EXCF, KTM 690 and whatnot, and I look at the Himalayan with something like 6 inches of suspension travel, 440 pounds. It is a single cylinder. It does have a 21-inch front wheel, but there's just something about the Himalayan specifically that I still feel like the KLR 650 is a more capable machine because of the suspension travel, even though technically it weighs slightly more than the Royal Enfield does. Um, but I think the last piece of this question is to exclude the TW200 and the Royal Enfield Himalayan because one fits but the other one doesn't, and most people would say it should be the reverse. Can any of these motorcycles finish a hare scramble? I've done a hare scramble on the CRF 250L. It's a horrible race bike, but it's completely capable within the amount of time that I'm given that it will still finish. It might be last or second to last, but it'll still finish. Can a Royal Enfield Himalayan finish a hare scramble? Can a TW200 finish a hare scramble? I do think that both of them are capable in the right hands, but they're both probably the last of the choices that we would make, other than we just want to prove a point. So in both of those cases, you could say that they're on the fringe of being a dual sport, but I don't think the actual intent is for them to be a dual sport. So to wrap it up a little bit more, let's take a look at, like I said, even if I draw that circle of 21-inch front wheel, single cylinder, DOT equipment, and the caveat, can it finish a hare scramble? We're still talking about a whole bunch of bikes that were actually race bikes that they put DOT equipment on. And then you have old equipment like the XR650L, the KLR 650, the DR 650. These are old, 20-year-old designs that are air-cooled engines that are extremely heavy. And they have a lot of suspension travel, especially the XR650L. It's a very, very capable motorcycle if you can handle its height and its weight. Those bikes are ones where they have, longer maintenance intervals, and even some of the smaller ones I'll get into in a second. So you have dirt bikes that have maintenance schedules that are measured in hours like dirt bikes are, but have DOT equipment. So, you're looking at doing an oil change every 500 miles or so, or 15 running hours, whatever. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have bikes like the CRF 300L, which is basically a street bike engine wedged into a dirt bike like frame that you only have to change oil every 8,000 miles. So you've got, like I said, the heavyweight 650s that start to really encroach on adventure bike. Lots of people would say that the KLR is an adventure bike considering it weighs 400 pounds. But right in the heart of the middle of this, I see bikes like the WR250R, which is not to be confused with the WR250F, which is actually a race bike or an advanced trail bike that doesn't come with a plate. The WR250R is a purpose-built bike, similar situation to the CRF 300L. It's a street bike engine and a very capable frame. The KLX 300, the KLX 230, the CRF 300L Rally. That's what really gets into, like, CRF 300 Rally is an adventure bike by any other name. People call it the Africa Single, but because of the suspension travel and relatively lightweight, it weighs about the same thing as a KTM 690 Enduro. Both bikes, again, extremely capable off-road, but just because of their heavier weight, people would consider them adventure bikes. The KTM 350 and 500 are both 250 pounds, by the book oil changes every, like 15 hours or 500 miles or whatever. But you have all these other ones right in the center that they really are 50-50. Everyone knows I'm a former CRF 250L owner. That bike could do virtually anything I wanted it to do, but it's a jack of all trades, master of none. I loved it on the street and I loved it on the dirt, but it was not a good street bike and it was not necessarily a good dirt bike either. Some other things to mention here are, Beta makes 4 different models from 350 up to 500, 350, 490, I think it's a 410 or something like that, 430. Same thing, race bikes with plates and a bunch of different displacements. I talked about the CRF 250L, 300L. There's also the CRF 450L, which is actually same concept. That's a 450X with DOT equipment, so that's actually more of a race bike than it really is a dual sport, even though it holds the L moniker. Lots of people know the DRZ 400. That bike comes in a supermoto as well as a dual sport. It's a little heavy, even though it's a liquid-cooled bike. But that's another perennial favorite for a lot of people that like what I consider to be the core of all these bikes that we're talking about. And then a few older models that are still hanging around that are in that smaller bore, the XT250 and the DR200. And there's a series of others. I want to say there's something like 20 some. But when you look at this market, that's why I brought this up. What is a dual sport? Because so many people think, well, just a dirt bike with a plate, a two-stroke with a plate is a dual sport. And I guess you can say that. But when I really want to get into the nuts and bolts of the dual sport market, I think there should be specifics and the breadth between a KTM 350 EXC, which is basically the exact same cross country Woods 350, but with a plate, and you go all the way back to the KLR 650, which is knocking on the door of being, we'll call it a lightweight adventure bike. There's a big range in all the bikes that are actually here, and I think it's important for people to understand exactly what is a dual sport, what that range looks like. And ultimately, I want to do a follow-on to this and look at a discussion and what all goes into all these models that I listed. And more specifically, I actually think that there's a relatively big hole in the kind of dual sport that most people want. So we'll catch you guys down the road.